There is someone you cannot stop thinking about. You have tried. You have applied logic. You have rehearsed every reason why you should be over it by now. But something in you keeps returning to them. Not out of weakness, not out of obsession, but because something deep inside you already knows what your mind has not yet accepted. This was never a coincidence. This person was sent. And what Carl Jung discovered about why certain people enter our lives will silence every doubt you have ever had about what you felt. There are moments in a life when something happens that cannot be adequately explained by reason alone. You can trace back the timeline. You can reconstruct the sequence of events. You can identify every practical detail that led to the moment you met this person. And yet, no matter how carefully you arrange those details, something remains that logic cannot account for. A feeling, a recognition, a shift in your interior world so sudden and so complete that the word coincidence simply refuses to fit. Dr. Nathaniel Cross had spent many years studying what he called the architecture of meaningful encounter. He was not a romantic by profession. He was a depth psychologist, trained in the tradition of Carl Jung, shaped by thousands of hours, sitting across from people who had come to him, carrying experiences they could not explain and feelings they could not resolve. And of all the themes that moved through his practice, one returned more consistently than any other. The theme of the person who arrived and changed everything. Not through grand gestures, not through dramatic declarations, but through something quieter and more permanent. Through the simple, devastating fact of their presence. Through the way they looked at you. Through the way something inside you recognized them before your mind had time to form a thought. A woman named Serena came to Dr. Cross in the third year of what she described as the longest confusion of her life. She was composed when she sat down. Her voice was steady, but her hands, folded carefully in her lap, told a different story. She had the hands of someone holding something very heavy, very still, for a very long time. She said, "I know what I am supposed to feel by now. It has been long enough. I have done everything I was supposed to do. I have kept busy. I have been practical. I have had conversations with myself at 2 in the morning that would have convinced anyone I had moved on." She paused. "But they are still there, not like a wound, like a knowing, and I do not know what to do with that." Dr. Cross listened, and then he said something that surprised her. He said, "Before we talk about what to do with it, I want you to consider that what you are carrying is not a problem to be solved. It is a message to be understood." Carl Jung wrote extensively about what he called numinous encounters, encounters that carry a quality of the sacred, of the significant, of something larger than the ordinary logic of daily life. He believed that not every meeting between two people occurs on the same level of psychological depth. Some meetings are casual. They leave no lasting imprint. They fade with the circumstances that produced them. But other meetings, he said, operate on an entirely different register. They do not simply add to your experience of life. They reorganize it. They reach into your interior world and rearrange something fundamental, something that was waiting perhaps for years to be rearranged. These are the meetings your soul engineers, not your ego, not your preferences, not your conscious plans for how your life should unfold. Your soul, that deeper intelligence that operates beneath the level of ordinary thought, and that is always, quietly and persistently, moving you toward what you need in order to become more fully yourself. When Serena described the moment she first encountered this person, she used a word that Dr. Cross had heard many times before. She said it felt like recognition, not attraction, though that was there, not compatibility, though that was there too, but something older, something that predated the meeting itself. As though some part of her had already known this person, had already been in conversation with them, long before the physical encounter occurred. Jung addressed this phenomenon directly. He spoke of the anima and the animus, the inner image of the other, that each of us carries from the very beginning of our psychological formation. This image is built slowly, assembled from fragments, from the way love was modeled in your earliest years, from the faces and voices of people who moved you without your understanding why, from dreams and longings and half-formed desires that you carried without names. And then one day, that inner image meets its external correspondence. You encounter in the physical world someone who matches the figure you have been carrying inside you, and the recognition is immediate, overwhelming, completely beyond the reach of rational explanation. Because it is not a recognition of them specifically. It is a recognition of something in you, finally reflected back at you through their eyes. This is why the feeling does not fade the way ordinary feelings fade. Because it is not an ordinary feeling, it is a psychological event, a collision between your interior world and the exterior world that leaves both permanently altered. Serena sat with that for a long time, and then she asked the question that most people eventually ask. But if this connection is so significant, if it is so real, why does it feel so incomplete? Why does it feel like something unfinished? Dr. Cross nodded slowly. He had been waiting for that question, because that question, he had come to believe, was at the very heart of what these encounters are actually for. They are not designed to be immediately complete. They are designed to initiate a process that begins the moment you recognize someone in that deep, inexplicable, bone-level way. And that process is not about the relationship itself. It is about what the relationship awakens in you. Jung described this through his concept of individuation, the lifelong journey of becoming who you actually are. Not who you were shaped to be, not who you learned to perform for the approval of others, but the authentic, whole, fully realized version of yourself that has been present from the very beginning, waiting beneath the constructed layers of personality and habit and fear to finally emerge. Certain people are sent into our lives to accelerate that emergence, not to become our destination, but to become our catalyst, to crack open something that had grown closed, to illuminate something that had grown dark, to reflect back to us, with a clarity that nothing else could produce, the truth of who we are and what we are ready to become. When this person entered Serena's life, they did not simply bring joy or connection or the warmth of being understood. They brought a confrontation, not a dramatic one, but a quiet, persistent confrontation with every part of herself that she had been avoiding. Every dream she had set aside because it seemed impractical. Every need she had minimized because she had been taught that needing things was dangerous. Every depth of feeling she had compressed because the world she had grown up in did not have room for the full volume of who she was. This person, simply by seeing her, had made all of that impossible to ignore any longer. And that is the first truth Dr. Cross always shared with his clients about these kinds of connections. The person who rocks your world this deeply is almost never rocking your world because of who they are. They are rocking your world because of who they are forcing you to see in yourself. They are a mirror. And the reason the reflection is so overwhelming, so persistent, so impossible to simply walk away from, is that what you are seeing in that mirror is not them, it is you. The full, undefended, finally acknowledged version of you. Now there is another layer to this, and it is the layer that most people find the most difficult to sit with, because when a connection of this depth forms, it rarely forms in only one direction. Dr. Cross had spent years observing what happens on both sides of these encounters. He had worked with people who were Serena, people who were carrying the weight of a connection that felt unresolved, unfinished, suspended somewhere between what was and what could have been. And he had also worked with the other side, with people who were on the inside of a silence that looked, from the outside, like absence, like indifference, like not caring, but that was never what it was. A man named Adrian came to Dr. Cross, not because he was suffering from a lost connection, but because he was suffering from his own inability to close a distance he had created. He had met someone 2 years before, had felt immediately and unmistakably the kind of recognition that had no logical explanation, had spent months moving closer to that person in small, careful increments. And then, at the moment when closeness became real, when the emotional depth became undeniable, he had withdrawn, completely, without warning, without explanation. And he did not understand why. "I did not want to leave," he told Dr. Cross. "I wanted the opposite of leaving. But something took over, some old machinery that I could not stop." Jung called this the autonomous complex, the unconscious psychological pattern that operates without the conscious mind's permission or knowledge. A pattern formed early in life, usually in response to emotional experiences that were too large or too painful to be fully integrated at the time. And these patterns, when triggered by precisely the right circumstances, activate completely. They override intention. They override desire. They drive behavior that the conscious mind watches with a kind of helpless confusion. For Adrian, the pattern was ancient. It had formed in the space between a child who needed love and a parent who was emotionally unavailable. It had encoded a simple, devastating belief that when love becomes real, When closeness becomes genuine, something will be taken from you. Something will break. Something will prove that you were wrong to open. And so the pattern had learned to preempt that loss, to leave before being left, to create the distance before the distance was created by something else. He was not cold. He was not unfeeling. He was not absent of care. He was terrified, and his terror had taken the wheel. This is what Serena could not see from the outside. She saw the distance. She felt the silence, and the silence, as it always does, amplified every doubt she carried. Maybe she had imagined the depth. Maybe the connection was one-sided. Maybe she had projected meaning onto something that was not there. But she had not imagined it, and it was not one-sided, and the meaning was entirely real. The silence was not evidence that she was wrong about what she felt. The silence was evidence that the other person was at war with themselves, that what they felt was so large, so real, so threatening to the defenses they had spent a lifetime constructing, that the only response their old patterns knew was retreat. And that retreat, as painful as it was for Serena to experience from the outside, was in its own way a form of acknowledgement. Because people do not retreat from things that do not matter. People do not construct elaborate emotional defenses against feelings that are insignificant. The ferocity of the retreat was, paradoxically, a measure of the depth of what they were retreating from. Jung wrote that until we make the unconscious conscious, it will direct our lives, and we will call it fate. Adrian was being directed by his unconscious, by patterns he had never examined, and choices he had never consciously made. And in that state, the very thing he wanted most was the thing he was most systematically destroying his ability to have. Serena listened when Dr. Cross explained this to her, not about Adrian specifically, but about the psychology of withdrawal in the context of deep connection. And something shifted in her face. Not relief exactly. Something quieter than relief. Something closer to understanding. She said, "So the silence is not about me." "The silence, Doctor," Cross said carefully, "is almost never about you. It is about what you represent, what you have awakened in them, and what they have not yet learned to hold." But understanding the psychology of another person, as important as that is never the place where real healing begins. And Dr. Cross was always very deliberate about this with his clients, because one of the most common traps people fall into when they are carrying a connection of this depth is the trap of making it entirely about the other person, about their patterns, their fears, their readiness or lack thereof, their eventual return or absent. And this focus, however understandable, misses the most important part of the entire experience, the part that is about you. Jung was unambiguous on this point. He said that we cannot change another person. We cannot accelerate their growth or force their awakening, or pull them into readiness before they have done the necessary interior work. But we can change ourselves. We can grow. We can awaken. We can do the interior work that is being asked of us. And in doing so, we change the entire energetic landscape of every relationship we are part of. Serena had been waiting, not passively. She had been active in her daily life, present in her obligations, functioning well in all the ways that are visible from the outside. But internally, in the deepest part of herself, she had been suspended, holding her breath, keeping some part of her internal world on pause, waiting for resolution to arrive from outside. And what Dr. Cross helped her see was that this suspension was the thing that needed to end. Not the connection itself, not her feelings, but the waiting, the holding of herself in abeyance, while the answer came from somewhere else. Because the answer was not going to come from somewhere else. The answer was always going to come from within her. And the resolution she was waiting for was not the resolution of the relationship. It was the resolution of something in herself that the relationship had brought to the surface. There was a part of Serena that had never fully believed she deserved the kind of love she had felt in that connection. Not consciously. Consciously, she was a capable, self-aware woman who understood her own value. But deep in the layers of the unconscious, in the place where the earliest messages about love and worth and safety are encoded, there was a quieter belief. A belief that depth was dangerous. That being fully seen was followed by being fully abandoned. That wanting something this real and this large was the surest way to lose it. And so, even as she consciously longed for this connection to be resolved and restored, some unconscious part of her was also quietly sabotaging her own peace, feeding the doubt, keeping herself in a state of anxious waiting that felt like devotion but was actually a very old form of self-protection. The real work, Dr. Cross told her gently, was not about him. It was about that belief, about finding it, examining it, understanding where it came from, and slowly, carefully, replacing it with something true. This is what Carl Jung meant when he wrote that the most important journey any human being can take is the journey inward. Not because the external world does not matter, but because the external world reflects the internal world with extraordinary precision. And if you want to change what you are experiencing on the outside, you must be willing to go inside and do the work that no one else can do for you. Serena began that work, slowly at first, with resistance that was completely natural, because real interior work requires you to look at things you have spent years finding creative ways not to look at. It requires honesty that is sometimes uncomfortable, courage that is sometimes exhausting, a willingness to sit in uncertainty without resolving it prematurely into something more manageable. But she did it, week by week, session by session, layer by layer, and something began to change. Not in the external situation. Nothing had changed there, but in her internal relationship to it. The weight of the waiting began to lift, not because she had given up, but because she had stopped making her own wholeness conditional on the outcome. She had stopped holding herself in suspension. She had returned to herself, and in returning to herself, something remarkable happened. The desperation that had colored her thoughts of this person began to soften, not into indifference, into something clearer, into a quality of presence that did not grasp or demand or try to force an outcome, into the kind of openness that does not need to be resolved because it is already complete in itself. Jung described this state as the transcendent function, the capacity to hold the tension of opposites without collapsing into either extreme, to hold both the love and the uncertainty, both the longing and the peace, both the openness to reunion and the wholeness that does not require it, and in holding that tension, to become something that neither extreme alone could have produced. This is the transformation that the most meaningful connections in our lives are actually designed to produce in us. Not simply a relationship, not simply a reunion or a resolution, but a fundamental expansion of who we are, a deeper knowing of ourselves, a more complete integration of the parts we had been keeping hidden even from our own awareness. Adrian, in his own parallel journey, was going through something similar. The withdrawal that had seemed so total, so final, was not the end of a story. It was the beginning of a confrontation with himself that he had been avoiding for as long as he could remember. The very connection he had retreated from was the one that kept returning in his dreams, in the quiet spaces between distraction, in the moments when he was most honest with himself. He could not unknow what he had felt. He could not return to the version of himself that had existed before that recognition had occurred. Because once the unconscious becomes conscious, as Jung said, it cannot be made unconscious again. The door, once opened, cannot be fully closed. It can be walked away from, but it cannot be sealed. And the longer he walked away, the louder the door became. This is what happens on the inside of a silence that looks from the outside like indifference. There is no indifference. There is a storm. There is the constant, exhausting work of maintaining a distance that the heart keeps trying to collapse. There is the comparison, arriving without invitation, between the depth of what was felt and the flatness of everything chosen instead. There is the moment, arriving again and again at unpredictable intervals, when the question can no longer be avoided. What am I actually afraid of? And what exactly am I protecting myself from? The person who loves in silence, the person who withdraws from depth they cannot yet hold, is not your enemy. They are not evidence that you were wrong about what you felt. They are someone standing at the edge of their own psychological growth, looking at a leap that their old patterns are telling them is too dangerous to take. And whether they take that leap is not something you can control or engineer or wait for indefinitely without cost to yourself. What you can do is this: you can take your own leap. You can do your own work. You can stop making your expansion conditional on their timing. You can return to yourself so completely, so honestly, so fully, that the version of you they eventually encounter, if they do, or that the rest of your life encounters, is the most whole and true and magnificent version of yourself that this experience could have produced. Because that is the gift. That is the real gift of the connections that shake us to our foundations. Not the relationship itself, though that can be extraordinary, but the person we become in the process of holding it. The depth we discover, the truth we can no longer pretend not to see. the love we learn to give ourselves, steadily and completely, in the same way we once longed to receive it from someone else. Serena came to her last session with Dr. Cross on a morning in early spring. She sat differently than she had on that first autumn afternoon. The hands in her lap were relaxed. The weight she had been carrying so carefully for so long was no longer visible in her body. She said, "Something happened this week. I was thinking about him and I noticed that the thought did not hurt. It was just there, warm almost, like a memory of something real, rather than the absence of something lost. And I thought, that is different. That is new." Dr. Cross smiled. "That," he said, "is what resolution actually feels like. Not closure, exactly. Not forgetting, but a settling, a coming to peace not with the outcome but with the experience itself, with what it gave you, with who it helped you become." She nodded slowly. "I am different because of it," she said, "and I think that was always the point." Jung wrote, near the end of a long and extraordinary life spent mapping the interior landscape of the human being, that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, not the version of yourself shaped by fear or approval, or the 1,000 compromises that accumulate over years of trying to make yourself acceptable, but the authentic, complete, fully inhabited version of yourself that has been present from the very beginning, waiting beneath everything else for you to finally be brave enough to choose it. The person who appeared in your life and would not leave your mind is part of that journey. They are a chapter in the story of your becoming. Not necessarily the final chapter, not necessarily the chapter you expected, but a necessary one, a real one that has already changed you in ways you are only beginning to understand. The question is not whether this connection will resolve in the way you once hoped. The question is what you are going to do with everything it has revealed, with the depth it has shown you that you are capable of, with the truth it has made impossible to unsee, because that depth belongs to you. It was never theirs to give or take. It was always yours. And now that you know it is there, you cannot unknow it. You cannot return to living as though it does not exist. You cannot settle for less than the full volume of what you are. That is the message this person was sent, not with words, not with easy resolution, but with the quiet, irreversible, life-altering fact of their presence in your story. The message has been received. Now comes the living of it. And that, in the end, is the whole point.